My husband left me for a younger woman and took our family overseas. He said, "Be gone when we return." When they came back, our house was gone. I watched from my car, smiling, before I tell you what happened next. If you're watching this, please hit subscribe to her voice. And tell me in the comments which part shocked you the most. I remember the exact moment I realized my life had changed forever. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and I saw his name flashing on the screen. Richard. I thought it would be another mundane message about bills, or maybe a question about Emily or Liam. But the words that appeared made my hands tremble and my heart tighten in a way I hadn't felt in decades. Be gone when we return. I hate old things. I work hard, so I deserve a new life. I stared at that message for a long time, letting each word sink in. My husband, my companion of 35 years, had decided I was disposable. Just like that, the house I had raised our children in, the walls that held laughter and whispered secrets, suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even call him. I just walked out to the car, the morning sun warming the leather seat beneath me. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my fingers tight around the edges, and watched them leave. Richard, Emily, Liam, and Sophie, his younger, shiny replacement. The way they laughed as they loaded their bags into the SUV, the way Sophie clung to him, the careless joy in their voices. It was unbearable, and yet, strangely, it didn't break me. I felt a quiet clarity settle over me. I realized that this was my moment, my choice. I could collapse in grief and rage, or I could breathe, watch, and plan my next steps with the clarity only heartbreak can provide. And I did breathe, slowly, deliberately, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I let the tension fall from my shoulders. My eyes followed their car as it disappeared around the bend, leaving a trail of dust and sun behind it. For the first time in years, the house was mine alone. And though my chest ached, I felt a strange freedom. The walls whispered to me, memories pressing close. The birthdays, the scraped knees, the late-night talks over coffee. All of it. And I realized this freedom, this empty, painful space was the beginning of something I hadn't dared to imagine. Life on my own terms. I turned the key in the ignition, my heartbeat slow and steady now. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just smiled. Not a cruel smile, but a quiet one, the kind that grows from deep inside, knowing that no one can take your dignity. No one can erase the years you've lived with love and strength. And as the car hummed beneath me, I allowed myself one final glance at the house, my home, my memories, my past, and I whispered to the silence around me, "This is not the end, it's the beginning." The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that presses into your chest and makes you feel both small and endless at the same time. I walked from room to room, my footsteps soft on the familiar wooden floors, and for a moment I thought I might collapse under the weight of all the memories. The smell of old cedar in the living room, the faint trace of coffee in the kitchen, the way the sunlight hit the picture frames on the hallway wall, all of it was mine. Every corner, every creak of the floorboards reminded me that I had built this life with my own hands. And yet, it had been dismissed with a single text. I found myself in the living room, staring at the old sofa where we had argued, laughed, and sometimes cried. The cushions bore the faint imprint of shoulders I had known intimately for decades. I reached out and touched the fabric, feeling the threads under my fingertips, and let a shiver run through me. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was recognition. Recognition of what had been lost, yes, but also of what remained, me fully, without compromise, without apology. In the kitchen, I opened cabinets and drawers, pausing over the mismatched mugs, the worn cutting boards, the recipe cards faded with use. Richard had always overlooked these small details, the everyday things that make a house a home. I realized he had never truly seen them, never truly understood that a life built with care and patience has a weight no one can simply erase. And in that moment, I felt something subtle but powerful stir in my chest, a quiet certainty that he had underestimated me. I sat at the dining table, my hands folded in my lap, and let my mind wander back through years of dinners, birthdays, late-night talks, and Sunday breakfasts. Emily and Liam had grown here, their voices echoing off the walls like ghosts of laughter and love. I felt a pang, of course, of loss, of the life that had once been so ordinary and safe, but it was tempered by a strange, fierce clarity. They had thought leaving me behind would break me. They had thought an empty house would leave me helpless, but it hadn't. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling slowly, carrying a faint scent of chamomile, and took a sip, letting it ground me. Outside, the world went on as it always does. Cars passed, birds sang, a neighbor mowed his lawn. Life moved forward whether we wanted it to or not, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine moving forward with it, not running after Richard, not begging for recognition, but quietly reclaiming what was mine. Every letter, every document, every detail I had left behind would serve as proof of my life, my choices, my dignity. I walked through the house one last time that evening, pausing at the windows to look out at the quiet street. The shadows were long, the sunlight soft, and I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't expected, calm. And behind the calm, something stronger, a plan forming in silence, a patience born from heartbreak. They would return thinking they could walk back into a life they had abandoned. But I would be ready, and in that readiness I found a strange, comforting satisfaction, the beginning of my quiet, inevitable justice. I found the letters tucked away in the back of a drawer, the edges curling slightly, the ink faded but still sharp with arrogance. They were Richard's, of course, written to Sophie, detailing his plans, his excitement, the way he had dismissed me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. At first I hesitated, my hands trembling over the paper, afraid of the sharp sting they might bring. But I opened the first one, and the words spilled over me, burning and bitter. I deserve more than this life. I deserve someone young, someone who doesn't hold me back. He had written it with a careless certainty, like he believed the world itself owed him a fresh start, a better version of himself, and that I, the woman who had shared decades with him, was simply obsolete. I sat down at the kitchen table, letting the letters fall gently around me like fallen leaves. I read each one slowly, deliberately, savoring the clarity they brought. Every boast, every plan, every selfish thought he had penned was a mirror of the man he truly was. The man I had loved once was gone, replaced by someone small, blind with vanity, incapable of seeing what he had. And with that realization came something I hadn't expected, a quiet sense of relief. I had spent years defending my choices, my love, my home, only to realize that none of it had needed defending. I had lived my life fully, while he had abandoned everything that mattered in pursuit of his own fleeting satisfaction. There was pain, yes, a deep, familiar ache that pressed against my ribs and made my chest feel heavy. But intertwined with it was clarity, a sense of knowing that the power had quietly shifted. He had thought that leaving me behind would strip me of dignity, but in truth, it had shown me just how much strength I carried. I could see, in stark detail, the arrogance that had driven him away, the blindness that would one day undo him. And I understood, with a sudden, sharp precision, that I had the ability to act, carefully, deliberately, quietly. The letters were more than proof. They were a map. They showed where he had invested his attention, where he had spent his energy, and, crucially, where he had left gaps. I could see opportunities hidden in plain sight, mistakes he had made in his hubris, oversights he hadn't considered because he had never truly respected me or this home. And with every word I read, I felt the simmering of a plan, subtle and precise, forming like a seed beneath the surface. Not vengeance fueled by anger, but a kind of poetic justice, quiet, unassuming, yet unavoidable. I gathered the letters carefully, stacking them neatly in a folder I could hide away. There was no need for confrontation yet, no need for theatrics. Patience, I realized, was my ally. I had watched them leave, I had endured their absence, and now I could watch them return. The thought made a small, unexpected smile tug at my lips. I would not chase them. I would not plead. I would simply wait, quietly, assured in the knowledge that the truth of who I was and who he had become would reveal itself in its own time. And in that waiting, I felt a deep, almost sacred satisfaction settle in my chest, steady and calm, like the slow pulse of a life I was finally reclaiming for myself. I knew I couldn't carry all of this alone. The weight of betrayal, the quiet planning, the simmering need for justice, it pressed against my chest in a way that made even my breath feel heavy at times. That's when I thought of Nancy. She had been my neighbor for decades, our lives intertwined by backyard fences, shared holidays, and the gentle rhythm of small-town Toledo. She had seen me through minor heartbreaks, illnesses, and all the ordinary trials of a life fully lived, and now she would see me through this. I called her that afternoon, my voice calm, steady, though I could feel the tension humming beneath it. "Nancy," I said, "I need your advice." She didn't hesitate. She understood the weight behind my words immediately. She came over, her steps light but purposeful, her presence like a balm to the jagged edges of my emotions. We sat at the small kitchen table, cups of tea in front of us, the steam curling into the air, warm and comforting. I told her everything, the text, the letters, the way Richard had abandoned me, the house, our children. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I spoke with measured clarity, letting her witness the truth, letting her understand the depth of what had been done. Nancy listened, nodding softly, her hands folded neatly over her cup. She didn't judge, didn't offer hollow platitudes. Instead, she asked questions, precise and thoughtful. "What do you want, Margaret? What do you hope to achieve?" And I realized in that moment that the answer was simple, though profound. I wanted what was mine. I wanted dignity, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming the life he had tried to erase. I wanted him to understand, without me having to raise my voice, that his arrogance had limits, that every choice has consequences. Together, we began to map it out. Nancy, ever practical, reminded me of legal steps, property rights, and the careful collection of proof. She reminded me that patience was key, that the smallest misstep on his part could reveal more than any confrontation ever could. I felt a thrill of quiet anticipation, the kind that comes not from anger, but from knowing you hold a subtle power others do not recognize. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, imagining each step Richard might take upon returning. I thought about the choices he had made, the self-importance that had blinded him, and the delicate threads of his arrogance that I could gently unravel. It wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity, about showing, without words or anger, the measure of his actions. I spent that evening arranging papers, reviewing documents, cataloging letters, and filing away proof. My movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, Each step reinforced my resolve. The house, once a place of shared life, was becoming a sanctuary of my independence. And beneath the quiet, careful preparation, a subtle, thrilling thought kept returning to me. When they came back, they would find not the weak, abandoned woman they expected, but someone who had reclaimed her world with grace, patience, and precision. I began taking the first careful steps to reclaim what had been taken from me. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no shouting matches, no impulsive decisions, just quiet, deliberate action. I met with Tom Harrison, my lawyer, a man I had known for years and trusted like family. We went over the property, the letters, the finances, every small detail Richard had overlooked in his arrogance. Tom didn't just nod politely. He examined everything with sharp eyes, offering subtle strategies that felt almost poetic in their precision. "Patience, Margaret," he said quietly. "The world often reveals its justice to those willing to wait and watch." I felt a thrill of calm satisfaction settle over me. This wasn't about revenge in the loud, angry sense. This was about balance, about letting the consequences of his choices unfold naturally, without me needing to shout or plead. I began to realize that my power wasn't in confrontation. It was in clarity, preparation, and the quiet assertion of my rights. Every meeting with Tom, every note I took, every small decision I made reinforced a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. After the meeting, I walked through the house, touching the objects that had once been ordinary and now felt almost sacred. The kitchen counters, the dining table, the photographs on the walls, each piece held a memory, a story, a piece of my life that had been ignored by someone who believed it insignificant. I let my fingers linger on the frames, the worn edges, and felt a deep, steady strength rise within me. I had lived this life fully. I had given love, care, and patience. And now, quietly, I would reclaim it. I also began noticing small opportunities in the world around me. The buyer for the house, the local interest in property, the subtle flaws in Richard's plans abroad, each tiny thread was something I could follow, something that would reveal itself in its own time. I made calls, left messages, took notes, but always with restraint. There was a rhythm to it, almost meditative. Each action was a step toward a moment that would arrive when it was meant to, a moment that Richard and Sophie would never anticipate. In the evenings, I sat with a cup of chamomile tea, looking out the window at the quiet street. The world went on. Cars passed, neighbors walked their dogs, children played in yards. And yet in that ordinary life I found a quiet exhilaration. I was no longer waiting for someone else to acknowledge my worth. I was defining it myself. Every breath I took, every deliberate choice I made, became a small act of reclamation, a reminder that my life, my dignity, and my home were mine alone to guide. And somewhere beneath that calm, steady determination, a small, secret thrill whispered to me. When they returned, expecting weakness, they would find strength. Not loud, not angry, not vengeful, but inevitable, graceful, poetic. I allowed myself a quiet smile and let the thoughts settle in my chest. The first moves had been made, and the quiet, powerful story of reclamation had begun. I needed to step outside the walls of the house, to walk the streets that had carried me for decades, to feel the pulse of life that had once been shared with Richard and our children. I wandered slowly, deliberately, down the familiar sidewalks of Toledo, letting the sights, sounds, and smells wash over me. The little cafe where we had celebrated anniversaries, the park where Emily had learned to ride her bike, the quiet corner bookstore that had always smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Each place pressed memories into me, bittersweet and sharp. It was painful, yes, but also clarifying. I paused at the cafe, watching the barista hand over steaming mugs of coffee with practiced care. Couples laughed quietly in corners, families shared stories over breakfast, and I realized how much life had gone on, unnoticed and uninterrupted, while I had been blindsided by betrayal. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the warmth spread through me, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to recognize that my world didn't end with his departure. My world was still here, steady, waiting for me to reclaim it. The park was quieter than I remembered. The swing set rusted slightly at the joints, the grass dotted with fallen leaves. I sat on a bench and let the memory of Liam learning to balance on the pedals and Emily's triumphant laughter fill the air around me. It hurt naturally, but it also reminded me of the resilience we had carried as a family. And that resilience, I realized with clarity, was still mine. They had abandoned it, yes, but it hadn't disappeared. It had simply been waiting for me to see it clearly. As I walked back toward the house, I noticed small details I had never appreciated before. The old street lamp that cast a golden glow at dusk, the scent of honeysuckle drifting from a neighbor's garden, the gentle creak of a bicycle chain as a boy rode past. Life was unfolding quietly, deliberately, like a story I was only now learning to read with full attention. And in those ordinary details, I found strength. Strength not in confrontation, not in loud declarations, but in the slow, measured understanding that my life, my choices, and my dignity were mine alone to guide. By the time I returned home, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the lawn. I lingered at the front door, feeling the smoothness of the handle, the familiar weight of the lock beneath my fingers, and realized that the house had become more than a structure. It was a repository of my memories, my victories, my losses, and my quiet power. They would return one day, and when they did, they would see not a woman broken by betrayal, but someone who had stepped into her own clarity, her own quiet authority. That night, I sat in the living room with the letters and papers I had collected, arranging them carefully on the table. A soft smile touched my lips as I considered the path I had begun, the quiet steps toward inevitable justice. Each memory, each document, each small action was a thread in the tapestry I was weaving, a tapestry of calm, deliberate, poetic vindication. And somewhere deep in my chest, a steady pulse of satisfaction told me that the story was just beginning. The day they returned, I watched from a distance, sitting in my car at the edge of the street. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, my breath calm, even as a small thrill ran through me. Richard, Sophie, Emily, and Liam pulled up, their laughter echoing down the quiet Toledo street. They were carrying bags, boxes, suitcases overflowing with the souvenirs of their overseas adventure. Bright scarves, trinkets, photographs of places I would never see through his eyes. They moved with that careless assumption of entitlement, unaware that the house they had left behind was no longer theirs to claim. I observed the way Richard handed Sophie the keys, the pride swelling in his chest as if he had conquered something monumental. He didn't notice my car parked around the corner, didn't see me watching, didn't know that my mind was already mapping the quiet unraveling of his arrogance. Emily and Liam followed behind, their faces a mixture of fatigue and excitement, unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. The moment was ordinary on the outside, but inside me, every detail was magnified, every gesture catalogued. When they stepped onto the porch, the first thing Richard noticed was the emptiness. His confident stride faltered, and I almost smiled at the subtle shift. Sophie's expression turned from excitement to confusion, then sharp panic as she tugged at his arm. Where "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't understand at first, his arrogance blinding him to the possibility that I had acted while they were gone. The letters, the planning, the patience. It had all led to this moment, and he hadn't seen it coming. I stayed hidden, letting them fumble with the front door, the keychain heavy in Sophie's hand. The realization hit them slowly, the shock spreading like ripples across the surface of water. The house was gone, sold, legally and properly, through careful preparation and foresight. Richard's jaw tightened, a flicker of panic in his eyes, while Sophie's face drained of color. Emily and Liam looked on, uncertain, the weight of their father's decisions beginning to settle over them. I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with anger. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply sat, breathing slowly, letting the moment unfold as it was meant to. The justice wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical. It was measured, inevitable, and deeply human. I had waited, prepared, and observed, and now the consequences of their choices were as clear as sunlight streaming across the empty lawn. As they stood there, bewildered and frustrated, I realized how much power lies in calm observation, in patience, in clarity. My revenge, quiet and poetic, didn't need words to be understood. And though I remained unseen, I knew they could feel it in the shift of the air, the sudden absence of control, the weight of the life they had abandoned. I drove away slowly, my heart steady, the house shrinking behind me. I wasn't running from them. I was moving toward a life I had reclaimed, a life of dignity, calm, and quiet triumph. And in that stillness, I let a small, serene smile form on my lips, knowing that the next chapter was mine to write, one deliberate, beautiful moment at a time. They didn't know I was there at first. They stood on the lawn, frozen, the kind of frozen disbelief that comes only when life refuses to follow the script you expect. Richard's eyes darted from the empty foundation to the neatly stacked documents I had left in the mailbox for the new owners. Legal proof, every step meticulously recorded, everything he had taken for granted undone in a single quiet stroke. Sophie clutched his arm, her voice high and shaky. How could this happen?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Richard's confidence cracked slowly, like ice under weight. He muttered something about lawyers and mistakes, about timing and overseas contracts, but it was clear he had no idea how thoroughly I had prepared. He hadn't imagined I could act while they were gone, and that arrogance, that blindness, had been his undoing. Emily and Liam watched silently, confusion and unease painted across their faces. I could see it, the first flicker of understanding that perhaps their father's choices weren't as unassailable as they once believed. I didn't approach. I didn't make a sound. I let them stumble through their realization, letting the silence carry the weight of what had been done. There is a subtle, potent satisfaction in watching someone confront the consequences of their own arrogance without interference. The letters, the careful legal steps, the planning and patience, it all spoke louder than any argument I could have made. Richard finally raised his voice, though it was unsteady. "Margaret, what is going on?" I stayed in the car, calm, watching him flail for control over a situation he had never anticipated. He had always believed that action without my consent meant dominance, that absence meant disregard. But here at this quiet moment, I held all the power. The home, the proof, the patience, the clarity, everything pointed back to a truth he could no longer deny. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, her earlier arrogance replaced by panic. She tried to assert control, to demand answers, but Richard's faltering voice betrayed the panic he had always hidden behind bravado. Emily and Liam, caught in the middle, finally exchanged glances, understanding in a way that had been absent during their father's relentless self-assurance. I could see the subtle shift in loyalty. The first hints that they were recognizing the man they had admired for years was, in fact, flawed and fallible. I breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the tension settle into the air. I didn't need to confront them. My quiet triumph was already complete. The subtle power of patience, foresight, and clarity had already done what anger could not. I had reclaimed not only the house, but the sense of dignity and control that had been threatened. When I finally drove away, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the empty lot. My heart was steady, my chest calm. I smiled softly, not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. Recognition of the quiet, inevitable justice that life, carefully observed and thoughtfully guided, can deliver. And in that moment, I understood fully that my strength had never depended on him or anyone else. It had always been mine, waiting quietly to be realized. I didn't need to approach them. The moment spoke for itself. I watched Richard fumble, his arrogance replaced by a hesitant, almost childlike uncertainty. He tried to assert authority, to demand answers, but every word he spoke was met with silence from the empty lot, the papers, the empty mailbox, the evidence of every careful, deliberate step I had taken. There was no one to blame but himself, and it showed. The realization hit him like a cold wind, leaving him exposed and unprepared. Sophie's panic grew, her hands shaking as she clutched at the letters and documents Richard had tried to ignore. Her glossy confidence had crumbled in moments, leaving behind only fear and confusion. I watched them, calm and poised in my car, letting the quiet tension fill the space between us. The irony was delicious, not in a cruel way, but in the subtle poetry of justice. Richard had always believed that strength came from dominance, from controlling the narrative. And now, without me lifting a finger in confrontation, he was powerless. Emily and Liam lingered at the edge of the lawn, hesitant and silent. I could see the struggle in their eyes, the conflict between their love for their father and the undeniable truth that he had made choices that weren't theirs to defend. It was a delicate moment, and I let it breathe. I didn't interfere. Every subtle shift, every flicker of comprehension, added to the quiet vindication I had cultivated for months. They were seeing him as he truly was, and I could feel the tension unravel in a way words never could have achieved. Richard finally straightened, his shoulders stiff, his voice low and uncertain. "Margaret, I didn't think you would—" He stopped, realizing the futility of his words. He had underestimated me completely, and it had cost him everything he thought he owned. I stayed hidden, my heart steady, my breath calm. The satisfaction wasn't in confrontation. It was in witnessing the natural consequences of his choices. The arrogance that had carried him overseas, the blindness that had allowed him to dismiss me, had finally met its match. Sophie's voice quavered as she tried to demand control, but the scene had shifted irrevocably. The documents, the letters, the careful planning, they spoke louder than anger, louder than explanations. Justice, I realized, does not always need to shout. Sometimes it arrives in quiet, deliberate steps, in patience and clarity, and in the serene understanding of one's own worth. I started the car, slowly, savoring the moment as I drove away. The sunlight caught on the edges of the empty lot, stretching long shadows across the ground where my home once stood. I felt no malice, no rush of anger, only a profound sense of calm and quiet triumph. I had reclaimed more than the house. I had reclaimed my dignity, my agency, and my sense of peace. The weight of their betrayal had transformed into a measured, deliberate victory, quiet, inevitable, and deeply human. As I rounded the corner, I allowed myself a soft, steady smile. The story wasn't over, not entirely, but the first crucial chapter of poetic justice had been written, and I knew, with a certainty that resonated through every fiber of my being, that life had a way of revealing truth, even to those who refuse to see it until it is too late. In the days that followed, I began to see the subtle consequences of my careful, deliberate actions. Richard and Sophie lingered in the town, visiting friends and trying in vain to project confidence, but the cracks in their facade were impossible to hide. I didn't confront them. I didn't chase them. I let the silence speak, and it did with a clarity that words never could. Every neighbor's glance, every whispered conversation, every subtle acknowledgement of the empty lot conveyed a truth they couldn't escape. Their assumptions, their arrogance had failed spectacularly. Emily and Liam, for their part, began to act differently. I noticed the way Emily hesitated when discussing their father, the way Liam avoided taking sides in conversations. I knew they were processing the reality of their choices, of the life they had been complicit in leaving behind. And while my actions hadn't been loud or confrontational, the effect was undeniable. It was as if the quiet weight of truth had finally settled over them, compelling reflection and awareness. I took comfort in ordinary moments that now felt infused with quiet power. I walked through the streets of Toledo, visiting the little cafes and shops that had always been part of my routine, and I noticed the difference in the way people looked at me. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with subtle respect, the kind earned through dignity and patience. It was a reminder that reclaiming one's life doesn't always require spectacle. Sometimes, the slow, deliberate assertion of agency speaks louder than any shout. In the evenings, I returned to the house that was now legally and fully mine, my sanctuary. I walked through each room, touched the familiar surfaces, and allowed myself to imagine the life I would build, unencumbered by Richard's selfishness or the weight of his choices. I organized the letters, the documents, every detail of preparation, not as trophies, but as reminders of the clarity and strength I had cultivated in silence. Every careful step I had taken now resonated like a quiet heartbeat through the rooms, affirming that I had acted not from anger, but from understanding, patience, and self-respect. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside moved on, I let myself feel a profound satisfaction. Not vengeance, not cruelty, but the serene, almost sacred knowledge that life had a way of balancing itself when one acts with patience, foresight, and dignity. I had waited, I had watched, and now in these quiet, ordinary days, the results were unfolding in the most subtle and beautiful way possible. I realized then that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, lingers in shadows, and unfolds gradually, like sunlight through the trees. And I, finally, had become the quiet force I had always needed to be. The storm had passed. The world was calm, and in that calm, I discovered the true measure of strength, patience, and quiet triumph. By now, the tension that had lingered like a shadow over my days began to shift, almost imperceptibly but unmistakably. Richard and Sophie had grown cautious, their earlier confidence replaced with a quiet unease. I noticed it in subtle gestures, a glance that lingered too long, a pause mid-sentence, a hand tightening over a coffee cup as if bracing for something they couldn't name. They hadn't realized how thoroughly I had acted, how deliberate my preparation had been, and the consequences were slowly unraveling around them. I spent mornings in the garden, pruning the rose bushes, planting small flowers along the edge of the walkway, savoring the ordinary tasks that now felt infused with quiet power. Each movement, each careful decision, mirrored the patience and precision I had cultivated in the legal steps, the letters, the documents. I began to see life as a series of deliberate choices, each one carrying weight. Each one capable of creating ripples that no arrogance or entitlement could withstand. One afternoon, Emily stopped by, unannounced. She hesitated at the doorway, her expression uncertain, a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. "Mom," she said softly, I didn't understand before, but now I see." She didn't need to say more. The weight of what had happened, the subtle justice I had enacted, had already spoken to her in ways I could not have articulated. She lingered, and for a moment I saw in her eyes the reflection of the woman I had become. Calm, composed, and quietly formidable. Richard and Sophie, meanwhile, were navigating the consequences of their choices on their own. The house had been legally transferred. The letters had documented every detail of their abandonment. They couldn't demand it back. They couldn't rewrite the story. And as they realized this, I could see the subtle shifts in their interactions, the quiet acknowledgement that the world does not bend for arrogance and self-interest. They had assumed absence meant weakness, but they were discovering that absence can also be deliberate, measured, and filled with strength. Evenings were my sanctuary. I would sit with a cup of tea by the window, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, neighbors chatting, the gentle hum of cars passing by. And in that ordinary rhythm, I found extraordinary peace. Every careful step I had taken, every decision made with patience and clarity, had culminated in this quiet victory. Not loud, not aggressive, not vindictive, but inevitable. I realized then, fully, that this story wasn't about punishment. It was about reclamation, about reclaiming dignity, agency, and peace. The poetic justice lay not in their discomfort, but in my calm, deliberate fulfillment of what had been mine all along. And in that realization, I felt the last vestiges of hurt and betrayal settle into a steady, enduring calm. I smiled softly, breathing in the quiet evening air, knowing that life, when approached with patience, clarity, and quiet strength, always has a way of balancing itself. The story was almost complete, and I was ready for the final chapter, knowing that the ultimate resolution would be as serene as it was inevitable. The day I had anticipated for months arrived without fanfare. Richard and Sophie came by, quietly, hesitantly, as if the world had shifted beneath their feet, and they weren't entirely sure what to expect. I didn't greet them at the door. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood in the living room, the late afternoon sunlight falling across the floor, letting them absorb the reality of what had unfolded. Their eyes widened as they saw the space, familiar, orderly, untouched by chaos, and the weight of their choices became tangible in that silence. Sophie glanced at the documents still neatly stacked on the counter, her earlier arrogance replaced by disbelief. Richard's shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the backs of chairs as though seeking support he had never truly needed before. For a long moment none of us spoke. I could hear my own steady breathing, the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, and the hum of the world outside. And in that stillness, I felt a profound sense of calm, the kind that comes not from victory over others, but from reclaiming oneself fully. Emily and Liam watched from the hallway, their expressions sober and reflective. There was a quiet acknowledgement in their eyes, an understanding that the life they had returned to was not the life they had left. They were seeing their father and perhaps themselves with new clarity, and I realized that the quiet, deliberate justice I had enacted extended beyond Richard and Sophie. It was a lesson in awareness, patience, and the natural consequences of choices. A lesson that could ripple across generations without me ever needing to raise my voice. I approached the front window and looked out at the street. The empty lot, the trees swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. The house was mine, fully and completely, not because I had fought loudly or angrily, but because I had acted with foresight, patience, and quiet determination. And in that realization, I felt a sense of liberation so profound that it filled my chest, steady and calm, like a heartbeat restored to its natural rhythm. Richard muttered something about mistakes and misunderstandings, but I didn't respond. There was no need. The poetic justice had already spoken. The arrogance, the carelessness, the disregard for what truly mattered, all of it had been met with a response that was measured, deliberate, and inevitable. It wasn't revenge fueled by bitterness. It was life, observed and guided with clarity, asserting balance in its own serene way. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, a cup of chamomile tea in my hands, reflecting on the months that had passed. I thought about patience, strength, and the quiet power of knowing one's worth. I thought about choices, consequences, and the subtle poetry of justice. And I realized that life, when approached with calm clarity, often resolves itself in ways more satisfying than any confrontation could ever achieve. I smiled softly, letting the warmth of the moment settle in my chest. The story was complete, but its lessons would linger, a reminder that dignity, clarity, and quiet strength carry far more weight than arrogance or impulsive ambition ever could. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes silence teaches more than words. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. Maybe your voice will be next on Her Voice.